If you walked the affluent streets of London's West End in the autumn of 1888, you would believe you were standing at the very center of the civilized world. You would see carriages polished to a mirror shine, hear the rustle of heavy silk gowns, and smell the expensive cigars cutting through the damp, sulphurous air. But beneath the soles of your boots, beneath the iron grates and the wet cobblestones, an entirely different city is breathing. It is a subterranean empire populated by 1.5 million souls. They move in absolute silence. They are stripped of their identities, forbidden from casting a shadow in the halls they meticulously polish. They are the domestic servants of the Victorian era. They hold the most intimate secrets of the most powerful people on earth, yet they are treated as though they do not exist. Welcome to the invisible city. The Victorian townhouse was not merely a home. It was a physical manifestation of class warfare, engineered with surgical precision to keep the wealthy masters and the impoverished workers entirely separate while occupying the exact same building. Consider the grand staircase at the front of the house. It is wide, bathed in natural light from towering windows, and covered in thick, plush carpets designed to silence the delicate footsteps of the elite. But hidden just behind the walls, twisting like the dark, suffocating intestines of the building, are the servants' stairs. They are narrow, incredibly steep, and perpetually cast in shadow. To walk up them carrying scuttles of heavy, black coal or buckets of boiling water is a daily dance with broken bones. You do not belong to the light. If you are a maid, you live in the freezing, drafty attics, sweltering in the summer and coated in ice during the winter. If you are a footman or a boot boy, your cot is down in the damp, rat-infested basement. You are strictly forbidden from ever using the front door. You enter and exit only through the tradesman's entrance below street level. If a member of the family happens to walk down a corridor while you are scrubbing the floorboards, you are instructed to immediately turn your face to the wallpaper, making yourself an inanimate object. You are a ghost, paid a pittance to haunt the house with absolute efficiency. The central nervous system of this oppressive ecosystem hangs on the wall of the basement hallway. It is a wooden board mounted with a row of small brass bells. Each bell connects to a taut copper wire that snakes up through the plaster and floorboards, terminating in the opulent drawing rooms and bedchambers above. When a wire vibrates and a bell violently shakes the heavy silence, you do not walk. You run. In 1888, your speed is your worth. Your silence is your virtue. Your complete lack of personal identity is your greatest professional asset. By the late 19th century, domestic service was the single largest employment sector in Britain. It was an industrial machine fueled not by steam or coal, but by human compliance. The vast majority of these workers were women and young girls. They were the scullery maids, whose hands cracked, blistered, and bled from scrubbing iron pots with caustic soda and harsh sand from before dawn until past midnight. They were the parlor maids, the tweenies, the housemaids who spent so much time scrubbing stone steps that their knees swelled with fluid, a painful condition doctors coldly dismissed as housemaid's knee. Which brings us to a terrifying question. If the entire foundation of your survival requires the complete erasure of your identity, who do you become when you are finally left alone in the dark? In the summer of 1888, the illusion of total aristocratic control began to fracture. The Victorian upper classes lived in a state of willful, terrified denial. They desperately wanted to believe their servants were simple, loyal, and content. But beneath the stoic faces of the men and women serving the soup, a quiet, desperate friction was sparking. The outside world was beginning to roar, and the vibrations were traveling down those copper wires into the basements. In July of that year, just weeks before the autumn that would stain London's history forever with the blood of Whitechapel, a profound paradigm shift occurred. Over 1,400 young women and girls walked out of the Bryant and May Match factory in the East End. It was the Match Girls' strike. They were protesting 14-hour workdays, poverty wages, and the horrific disease known as phossy jaw, a toxic necrosis caused by the white phosphorus they handled daily, which caused their jawbones to rot and literally glow in the dark. They won. It was a staggering, unprecedented victory for unskilled female labor, and the news of that victory bled into the servants' halls of Mayfair and Belgravia. It was whispered by the butcher's boy delivering meat. It was murmured by the coal heaver dropping sacks into the cellar. It was read from discarded, crumpled newspapers snatched from the master's wastebasket and smoothed out under the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle. Rebellion was in the air. But the domestic servant could not simply strike. They were fundamentally isolated. Unlike the factory workers who found massive solidarity on the factory floor and could walk out into the streets together, the servant was trapped. A townhouse only held a handful of staff. Worse still, they were bound by an invisible, unbreakable chain known as the character. A character was a written reference from an employer. It was the absolute currency of the lower classes. If a maid was dismissed without a character, whether for insolence, for breaking a vase, or for resisting the unwanted, predatory advances of a master's son, she was socially and economically annihilated. Without a character, no other respectable house would ever hire her. Without a character, the sheer drop from the basement of a wealthy mansion to the diseased, muddy gutters of the East End was merely a matter of days. The workhouse, prostitution, or starvation awaited. Therefore, the conflict of 1888 within the home was not a loud, fiery riot. It was a cold, silent war of psychological attrition. The upper classes felt this shifting energy. They could not prove it, but the paranoia crept into the drawing rooms. Wives began locking their tea caddies, wearing the keys on chatelaines at their waists, terrified their own staff were stealing from them. The masters slept in homes surrounded by strangers who knew everything. The servants washed the blood from the linens. They emptied the chamber pots. They read the discarded letters. They knew the debts, the diseases, and the infidelities. They possessed the power to ruin the masters with a single whisper, yet they were treated as though they were deaf and blind. This tension bred micro-rebellions. The parlor maid who intentionally chipped the rim of the mistress's favorite bone china teacup. The footman who spat into the silver soup tureen before carrying it into the dining room with a flawless, subservient bow. The cook who skimmed the household accounts, pocketing the difference to send back to a starving family in the shires. As the long, brutal summer faded into autumn, the days grew shorter. The gas lamps in the streets had to be lit earlier in the afternoon. For the scullery maid, who had been awake since 5 a.m, the coming of night offered no true rest. Her body was a map of aches. Her mind was numb. But as she finally climbed the dark stairs to her freezing attic, the basement below her remained a complex, dangerous place. For the true tragedy of the servants' world was not just the cruelty of the masters above. It was the realization that the basement itself was not a sanctuary of brotherhood. The oppressed do not always unite. Often they turn on each other. Down in the shadows, a ruthless, tyrannical hierarchy existed among the servants themselves, a pecking order so vicious it mirrored the very society that kept them all chained in the dark. It is a comforting myth to believe that those who suffer together stand together. We imagine the basement of the Victorian townhouse as a sanctuary of brotherhood, a place where the heavy mask of servitude finally slips away, and the exhausted workers share a loaf of bread in unified defiance of the lords and ladies asleep upstairs. We want to believe that the shared burden of poverty creates a bond of unbreakable solidarity. But human nature is rarely so poetic. The brutal truth of 1888 is that the oppressed do not always unite against their oppressors. Often, they meticulously recreate the very systems of tyranny that bind them, inflicting it upon whoever happens to be standing one rung lower on the ladder. Down in the gaslit shadows of the servants' hall, the true enemy is not always the wealthy master who pays the wages. Sometimes, the most terrifying predator in a young girl's life is the woman sitting at the head of the wooden dining table. To understand the absolute, ruthless political structure of the downstairs world, you must look at the physical space where they eat. The servants' hall is the dark, beating heart of the basement. It is dominated by a long, heavy oak table, scarred by years of use. 3 times a day, the entire staff gathers here for meals. But this is not a family gathering. It is a daily, silent reinforcement of a rigid caste system, orchestrated with the precision of a military parade. At the exact stroke of the grandfather clock in the corridor, the staff files into the room. They do not sit where they please. They sit in strict, unyielding order of precedence. At the very top of this subterranean aristocracy are the upper servants. The butler, a man whose entire dignity is measured by his stillness, and the housekeeper, a formidable woman wrapped in dark rustling silk, her waist heavy with the metallic clink of the household keys. They take their seats at the head of the long oak table. Flanking them are the valet and the lattice maid. These are the untouchables. They do not scrub stone floors. They do not carry heavy scuttles of coal. They interact directly with the masters, breathing the perfumed air of the upper floors, and they view the lower staff with the exact same disdain a wealthy duke might reserve for a street beggar. Below them sit the lower servants. The cook, the footmen, the upper housemaids. And at the very bottom, pushed to the darkest, draftiest end of the table near the kitchen door, sit the tweenies, the boot boys, and the scullery maids. When the midday meal of boiled mutton or beef is carved, it is served strictly by rank. The most tender cuts go directly to the butler and the housekeeper. The gristle, the fat, and the bones slowly make their way down the line, ending up on the chipped porcelain plates of the lowest tier. But the true psychological warfare begins when the meat is finished. By absolute, unspoken law, the moment the pudding or cheese is brought out, the upper servants rise from their chairs. In total silence, the lower servants must immediately drop their forks and stand at attention. The elites then turn their backs and leave the main hall to take their dessert and sweet wine in the pug's parlor. This is the private, locked sitting room reserved exclusively for the housekeeper and the butler. Only when the heavy oak door clicks shut are the lower servants permitted to sit back down and hurriedly finish their meager rations before the bells begin to ring again. This physical division of a single meal is a devastating daily reminder of who holds power and who holds absolutely nothing. The Bible of this era, Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, explicitly codified these divisions, turning the domestic home into a militarized zone of specific duties and impassable social borders. The financial chasm between the top and the bottom was staggering. A scullery maid making a miserable £10 a year was strictly forbidden from speaking directly to the butler, a man who might earn £60 annually and casually drink the master's leftover vintage port. If the scullery maid needed to communicate an issue, she had to pass the message up the chain of command, from the kitchen maid to the cook to the housekeeper. To break this protocol, to dare speak to an upper servant without being spoken to first, was an offense punishable by immediate dismissal. Imagine the sheer, claustrophobic terror of being a tweenie. You are a between maid, trapped in the crossfire of two competing tyrants. The upper housemaid demands you carry cans of boiling water up 5 flights of stairs to wash the bedroom grates, while the cook simultaneously screams for you to pluck a dozen pheasants in the sweltering kitchen. If you fail the housemaid, she will report you for insubordination. If you fail the cook, a heavy copper pan might find the side of your head. You belong to no one, and you are abused by everyone. The masters upstairs rarely dirted their delicate hands with the actual discipline of their staff. They delegated the cruelty. The housekeeper was the judge, jury, and executioner for the female servants. She inspected their fingernails for dirt, smelled their breath, and ruthlessly searched their meager wooden trunks for stolen candle wax, smuggled ribbons, or forbidden romantic letters. She controlled the rationing of tea and sugar, locking the precious supplies away in heavy wooden caddies, and dispensing them with a miserly, unforgiving hand. Why would a woman who herself is a servant treat her own kind with such venom? Because in the suffocating hierarchy of Victorian London, proximity to power was the only substitute for actual power. By enforcing the master's will with brutal efficiency, the housekeeper secured her own comfortable retirement. Sympathy was an expensive luxury she simply could not afford. She had to break the spirits of the younger girls before they could even think to rebel, ensuring the vast machinery of the house ran without a single stutter. This toxic environment bred deep, poisonous paranoia among the staff. Down in the basement, friendships were incredibly dangerous. A whispered secret or a tearful confession to a fellow housemaid could easily be traded to the housekeeper the very next morning in exchange for a lighter afternoon workload or an extra half-day off. The lower servants constantly spied on each other, maneuvering for the slight, fleeting favor of their immediate superiors. The servants' hall was a nest of vipers, a place where survival often meant stepping on the neck of the exhausted girl sleeping in the narrow cot right next to yours. The physical toll of this internal warfare was written on the bodies of the lowest tier. The scullery maid, entirely isolated at the bottom of the food chain, spent her days submerged in cold, greasy water, her skin raw and bleeding from soda ash. She was the first to rise at 5 in the morning to rake the ashes and light the massive iron kitchen ranges. She was the last to sleep, long after midnight, when the final copper pot was scoured blind. She lived in a state of perpetual, bone-deep exhaustion, made infinitely worse by the constant verbal degradation rained down upon her by the temperamental cook. If the oppressed perfectly mimic the cruelty of their oppressors, who is truly to blame for their suffering? It is easy to condemn the housekeeper or the butler for their iron-fisted tyranny. But they, too, were trapped in a system that demanded absolute perfection or total starvation. They lived in a state of constant, quiet terror of losing the master's favor, knowing perfectly well that one stolen silver spoon, one badly ruined dinner party, could see them thrown out into the cold streets just as easily as the lowliest boot boy. Their cruelty was born of survivalist fear. The entire Victorian townhouse was a fragile, towering house of cards, built on a trembling foundation of mutual suspicion and suppressed terror. As the autumn of 1888 settled over London, bringing with it the thick, choking yellow fogs that rolled off the freezing River Thames, the isolation of the lower servants became absolute. They were prisoners in a gilded cage, surrounded by staggering wealth they could never touch, abused by their peers, and entirely ignored by their masters. But this delicate, tyrannical ecosystem could only function as long as the servants remained completely dependent on the house. The upper servants held the ultimate weapon over the lower staff, a weapon far more dangerous than a docking of wages or a physical blow. It was a simple piece of paper. The character reference. The housekeeper and the butler were the absolute gatekeepers of this vital document. Cross them, and they would ensure you never worked in a respectable home again. As the winds grew colder outside the basement windows, the desperate need to secure and protect this piece of paper became a matter of literal life and death. Because out in the fog-choked streets of the city, a harsh winter was coming, and a terrible shadow was beginning to hunt those who had been cast out into the dark. Imagine a single piece of paper. It is not a banknote. It is not a deed to a sprawling estate or a royal decree. It is just a small, folded sheet of parchment, perhaps yellowed at the edges, bearing a few lines of black ink and the pressed wax seal of a wealthy household. For a Victorian master, this paper is a trivial administrative duty, hurriedly scribbled at a mahogany desk before retiring to the smoking room. But for you, the servant standing trembling in the hallway, this paper is your oxygen. It is your shield. It is the absolute, uncompromising difference between a warm bed in the attic and a shallow, unmarked grave in the mud of the East End. This piece of paper is the character reference. In the subterranean economy of 1888 London, it is the only currency that truly matters. Pause 2 seconds. Tone, urgent, lowering the pitch. To understand the sheer, suffocating terror that dictated the daily life of a domestic worker, you must understand a brutal reality of British common law during the 19th century. An employer was under absolutely no legal obligation to provide a departing servant with a reference. None. They could work you to the bone for 10 years, from the dark freezing mornings to the exhausted midnights, and if you offended them on your final day, they could simply refuse to write one. And without a character, you cease to exist in the respectable world. No aristocratic household would ever hire a maid, a footman, or a cook who arrived at the back door empty-handed. A missing reference was an automatic assumption of guilt. It meant you were a thief. It meant you were insolent. It meant, most devastatingly for a young woman, that you were morally compromised, perhaps dismissed because you had fallen pregnant. The society of the upper classes was obsessed with moral purity, a frantic desire to keep the filth and disease of the industrial slums from infecting their pristine drawing rooms. They viewed the lower classes as inherently corrupt, requiring constant, vigilant policing. Tone, sympathetic, highly visual. Because of this terrifying legal void, the character reference became a sacred relic. Young girls migrating from the starving agricultural shires to the blinding gaslights of London would keep their references folded into tiny squares. They would sew them into the inner linings of their heavy wool corsets. They would hide them at the very bottom of their wooden trunks, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp of the basement. They guarded these fragile pieces of paper more fiercely than their own health. Because the moment that paper was denied or destroyed, the descent into hell was staggeringly fast. Pause, 1.5 seconds. Tone, dark, atmospheric, street-level realism. Let us trace the footsteps of a housemaid dismissed without a character on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She is stripped of her uniform. She is handed her meager remaining wages, perhaps a few shillings. She walks out of the tradesman's entrance of a towering Belgravia mansion, carrying a single wicker basket holding everything she owns in the world. Where does she go? She cannot go home. The rural villages have no work, and the shame of returning ruined would destroy her family. So, she walks east. The grand, sweeping avenues of white stucco townhouses slowly give way to narrower streets. The air grows thicker, heavy with the stench of boiling bones, open sewers, and unwashed humanity. The warm, glowing windows of the West End are replaced by the broken glass and decaying brickwork of Spitalfields and Whitechapel. Within a week, her shillings are gone, swallowed by the exorbitant rent of a filthy lodging-house bed. She is forced to pawn her good boots, then her winter shawl. She is now starving, her body weakened by the freezing London rain. Tone grim, unyielding. Her final legal refuge is the workhouse, a towering, prison-like institution designed specifically by the government to be so horrific that only the truly desperate would seek its shelter. Inside, she will be stripped, her hair cropped close to her scalp to prevent lice. She will be forced into punishing, agonizing labor, tearing apart thick, tar-soaked ropes with her bare, bleeding fingers until her nails splinter. If she avoids the workhouse, the only other path is the pavement. The street corner, the flickering shadows beneath the railway arches. She becomes one of the tens of thousands of women forced into casual prostitution, simply to buy a crust of stale bread and a penny bed for the night. And in the autumn of 1888, standing in the fog of the East End as a vulnerable, desperate woman was a death sentence. The invisible predator with the long, thin blade was waiting in the dark courtyards, hunting precisely these women, the cast-offs, the forgotten, the ones who had lost their character and thus lost their right to the city's protection. Pause 2 seconds. Tone, contemplative, building intensity. When your absolute right to exist in society is dictated by a few lines of ink from an employer who does not even bother to remember your last name, are you truly a free citizen, or are you simply a ghost waiting to be banished? This paralyzing fear of dismissal forged the ultimate survival mechanism of the domestic servant. Invisibility. To survive the Victorian basement, you had to become a master of self-erasure. You learned to walk down the narrow corridors without making a single sound, rolling your steps from heel to toe to keep the floorboards from creaking. You learned to breathe softly, to never cough, to never sneeze in the presence of the masters. You learned to empty the ashes from the fireplaces with a delicate, agonizing slowness, so the soot would not billow and ruin the Persian rugs. You became an automaton, a machine of flesh and bone. If the master of the house flew into a violent rage and hurled a crystal decanter at the wall, you stood perfectly still, your eyes locked onto a blank spot on the wallpaper, betraying no emotion, no shock, no judgment. You were a piece of furniture that could bleed. Tone cynical, sharp. But this desperate need for references also spawned a shadowy, underground rebellion. When the law offers no protection, the desperate invent their own justice. A clandestine market of forged characters thrived in the grimy taverns and narrow alleys of the city. For a few shillings, a disgraced former clerk or a literate beggar would sit in a dimly lit corner, dipping a steel pen into a bottle of ink, and expertly mimic the flowing, elegant handwriting of a wealthy countess. They would invent glowing histories of unwavering loyalty and spotless moral conduct. Women who had been thrown into the gutters for the crime of dropping a silver tray would walk into new interviews armed with these beautifully crafted lies. It was a staggering risk. If a housekeeper or an employer discovered the forgery, the police would be called instantly. Forging a character reference was a severe criminal offense under Victorian law, punishable by hard labor in a brutal penitentiary. Yet, thousands took the risk every single year, because the threat of prison was marginally better than the absolute certainty of starving to death in a frozen gutter. Tone, intimate, shifting perspective. This was the razor-thin wire upon which the servants balanced their entire lives. Absolute compliance, driven by absolute terror. They scrubbed, they polished, they carried mountains of coal up dizzying flights of stairs, all while carrying the heavy, silent weight of their own precarious existence. Yet, in this grand, terrifying theater of class division, a profound and dangerous paradox was growing. The upper classes demanded that their servants be invisible. They demanded they act as mindless machines. But you cannot place a human being inside the most intimate spaces of your life and expect them not to see. You cannot expect them not to hear. The invisible ghosts of the townhouse were watching everything. As they knelt on the floorboards, silently polishing the brass fire irons, they listened to the whispered arguments between husband and wife. As they emptied the wastepaper baskets, they smoothed out the crumpled, tear-stained letters from angry creditors and secret lovers. As they washed the expensive linen bedsheets, they saw the undeniable, physical evidence of hidden diseases and moral decay. Tone slow, deliberate, profound. The master might hold the power to destroy the servant with a single piece of paper, but the servant held the power to destroy the master with a single, perfectly placed whisper. The grand Victorian homes were not fortresses of high morality. They were glass houses, built on a trembling foundation of secrets, and the invisible people trapped in the basement knew exactly where every single stone was hidden. Imagine holding a sharpened steel razor against the throat of a man who could destroy your life with a single word. You can feel his pulse violently beating against the cold metal. You smell the stale, fermented brandy on his breath from the night before. He closes his eyes, completely surrendering his fragile life to your steady, calloused hand. Yet, when he opens them, he looks right through you as if the room is entirely empty. This is the profound, terrifying paradox of the Victorian master and servant. They lived in a state of extreme physical intimacy, yet absolute social distance. The upper classes built impenetrable, towering fortresses of etiquette to keep the grimy industrial world out, but inside their own lavish bedchambers, they were entirely helpless. They did not draw their own baths. They did not brush their own hair. They did not even possess the basic skills to dress themselves. For the valet and the lady's maid, invisibility was not just about staying out of the way. It was about becoming a silent, breathing vault for the most explosive secrets of the British Empire. Society demanded that the wealthy present a flawless, impenetrable facade of moral purity, religious piety, and financial invulnerability. But the servants knew the absolute truth. They were the ones who cleaned up the quiet, bloody messes when the facade inevitably cracked. Consider the lady's maid. She is the very first person her mistress sees in the morning, and the last person she sees at night. Her days are measured in agonizing attention to physical detail. She unlaces the suffocating, rigid whalebone corsets that crush the ribs and deform the internal organs of the aristocratic women. She brushes out the long, heavy hair, pulling out the expensive, false hairpieces that society rigidly believes are entirely natural. She washes the intimate linen. And because she washes the linen, she knows exactly what is happening in the dark. She knows if the master is secretly visiting the mistress's bed, or if they have not spoken a single word to one another in months. She knows if there is a hidden, shameful pregnancy that must be tightly concealed beneath layers of dark, heavy velvet. She knows the exact shade of the chemical dyes and the highly toxic, lead-based powders her mistress uses to desperately cling to fading youth. She is the one tasked with locking the dangerous arsenic wafers away in heavy mahogany cabinets, so the children do not eat them. She sees the mistress weep uncontrollably in the dead of night, only to present a face of frozen porcelain to the world at breakfast. The valet knows even more. He is the permanent, silent shadow of the patriarch. He empties the master's pockets at the end of a long, mysterious evening. He finds the crumpled betting slips from illegal, smoke-filled gambling dens in Mayfair. He finds the heavily perfumed, desperate notes from young actresses and impoverished prostitutes hiding in the narrow alleys of Covent Garden. He brushes the thick, foul-smelling mud of the East End off the master's expensive wool trousers, mud acquired during midnight excursions into the very slums the master publicly and loudly condemns in the grand halls of Parliament. The Victorian postal service was a marvel of the modern world, delivering mail up to 12 times a day in central London. The footman and the butler were the absolute gatekeepers of this relentless flow of dangerous information. They received the sealed envelopes at the front door. They arranged them geometrically on polished silver salvers. They carried them into the private studies and drawing rooms. And as they offered the silver tray, they watched. They watched the blood drain from the master's face as he recognized the rushed handwriting of a ruthless debt collector. They saw the mistress's hands violently tremble as she broke the crimson wax seal of a forbidden lover's note. The servants stood silently by the mahogany doors, absorbing the silent panic that suddenly filled the room. In 1888, London was quietly ravished by an epidemic of venereal disease. While the Contagious Diseases Acts had recently been repealed, the rampant spread of syphilis among the upper classes was a fiercely guarded, terrifying secret. The official public records always showed gentlemen dying of nervous exhaustion or neurological decline. But the valet knew the truth. The valet was the one who saw the weeping sores on the pale skin. The valet was the one who discreetly disposed of the blue mass pills, the highly toxic mercury treatments prescribed by expensive private doctors, who only ever entered the townhouse through the back door to avoid being seen by the neighbors. The servant watched the master slowly go mad from the disease, suffering terrifying night terrors, all while fetching his top hat, his silver-tipped cane, and his leather gloves for Sunday church service. How does it feel to spend your entire life serving a god who is secretly rotting from the inside out? This forced, daily intimacy created a psychological minefield. The masters were terrified of their servants. They lived with the constant, gnawing anxiety that a disgruntled footman or a dismissed maid might go to the sensationalist penny press, or worse, to a bitter social rival, and whisper the truth. Blackmail was a very real, very terrifying threat in Victorian high society. A single mislaid letter or an overheard argument could utterly destroy a family name that had taken centuries of ruthless maneuvering to build. To combat this overwhelming fear, the masters weaponized their authority. They enforced a rigid code of absolute silence and total submission. A servant who showed any sign of understanding, any flicker of recognition of the master's sins, was immediately dangerous. If a valet accidentally made eye contact in the silver mirror while covering up a violent bruise on the master's neck, that valet would be dismissed by nightfall. You had to play the absolute fool. You had to cultivate an expression of profound, unshakable stupidity. Pretending that you did not understand the nature of the blackmail letters, you were explicitly instructed to throw directly into the roaring drawing-room fireplace. But the burden of carrying these dark secrets took a devastating toll on the minds of the workers downstairs. They lived in a permanent state of cognitive dissonance. They were subjected to daily, hypocritical lectures on morality, virtue, and Christian duty from employers who routinely broke every single commandment the moment the sun went down. The servants were forced to attend family prayers every morning, kneeling on the cold stone floors of the dining room, listening to the master read passionately from the Bible, knowing full well that the master had spent the previous night in a notorious brothel in Soho. The hypocrisy was suffocating. It bred a deep, quiet cynicism in the basement. The lower classes were constantly told by politicians, judges, and priests that they were biologically inferior, morally weak, and inherently prone to criminality. Yet, every single day they witnessed the staggering, unchecked depravity of their so-called betters. They realized quickly that morality was simply an expensive luxury item, something only the rich could afford to break without consequence. They became masters of double lives. Upstairs, they were the perfect, obedient automatons, speaking only in soft, deferential tones. They glided across the thick carpets like shadows. But downstairs, in the brief, stolen moments of safety after midnight, the heavy masks slipped. The mimicry was savage and relentless. The tall footmen would cruelly imitate the master's pompous stutter and his drunken, pathetic stumbling. The exhausted maids would mock the mistress's hysterical tantrums and her desperate, pathetic vanity. It was their only release valve, a desperately needed psychological defense mechanism against the soul-crushing weight of their own enforced insignificance. But laughter in the damp basement could only do so much to heal a broken spirit. The reality of their existence was inescapable. They were trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by staggering wealth they could never claim, eating the cold, fatty scraps left over from 12-course feasts they had spent 14 straight hours preparing. They lived amidst vibrant silk and crushed velvet, but their own tired bodies were permanently wrapped in coarse, scratching wool. They were the ultimate intimate strangers. They knew the exact temperature the master preferred his morning bathwater. They knew the precise way the mistress liked her Ceylon tea poured. They knew the deepest, darkest hidden fears and the ugliest sins of the people they served. Yet, they also knew with absolute certainty that if they were to drop dead of a sudden heart attack in the hallway, the master would merely step over their lifeless body and ring the brass bell for an immediate replacement. This profound psychological alienation was matched only by the physical destruction of their own bodies. The masters viewed the servants not as fragile human beings, but as a biological machinery specifically designed to absorb the heavy friction of daily life. The Victorian era worshipped progress, invention, and the mechanical perfection of the roaring steam engine. In the aristocratic home, the servant was the steam engine. And just like any machine run at maximum capacity without ever being oiled, rested, or repaired, the human engine was bound to catastrophically break down. While the masters fretted endlessly over their reputations and their hidden diseases, a much more visible, undeniable epidemic of physical ruin was sweeping through the dark, damp corridors of the basement. A terrifying destruction of bone, muscle, and blood that the upper classes conveniently chose never to see. The Victorian era was defined by an absolute, almost religious worship of the machine. The great minds of the 19th century were entirely consumed by the roaring power of steam, the relentless rhythm of the iron factories, and the sprawling network of railways that pumped lifeblood into the British Empire. They believed that anything could be engineered, optimized, and pushed to its absolute breaking point for the sake of maximum efficiency. But the most heavily exploited machine in London was not made of brass or steel. It was made of flesh, bone, and blood. It was the body of the domestic servant. To understand the sheer, catastrophic physical toll of this hidden world, you must strip away the romance of the period dramas and look closely at the hands of a 19-year-old scullery maid. They are not the hands of a human being. They are specialized industrial tools. The skin is boiled red and stripped of its natural oils by daily submergence in caustic soda and boiling water. The knuckles are swollen and permanently scarred. The fingernails are cracked, split down the middle, and perpetually packed with black soot. When the wealthy masters looked at their staff, they did not see people. They saw biological engines specifically designed to absorb the immense, crushing friction of daily life. And just like any machine run at maximum capacity without ever being rested, oiled, or repaired, the human engine was mathematically guaranteed to break down. The sheer volume of manual labor required to keep a grand London townhouse functioning in 1888 is almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. The entire aristocratic lifestyle was built on a terrifying defiance of gravity and thermodynamics, and the servant was the only counterweight. Consider the coal. A standard Mayfair mansion consumed up to 30 tons of coal every single year. That coal did not magically appear in the roaring fireplaces of the drawing rooms and the master bedchambers. Every single ounce of it was delivered to the damp, freezing cellar below the street. And from that cellar, every single ounce of it had to be carried up 3, 4, or even 5 flights of steep, treacherous stairs. Imagine the reality of the housemaid at 5 o'clock in the morning in the dead of winter. The house is pitch black and freezing cold. Her breath plumes in the icy air of her attic room. She descends the dark stairs to the cellar and fills a heavy iron coal scuttle. The scuttle alone weighs nearly 10 pounds, and the coal adds another 20 or 30. She must carry this dead weight up the twisting, unlit servants' stairs. Her spine twists unnaturally. Her shoulders scream in protest. The fine, black coal dust coats her throat and settles deep inside her lungs, mimicking the black lung disease of the miners in the northern pits. She will make this agonizing climb dozens of times a day, and then she must carry the heavy, dusty ashes back down. Next, consider the water. Indoor plumbing in 1888 was a luxury largely confined to the basement kitchens, or perhaps a single water closet on the ground floor. Yet, the Victorian upper classes were developing an obsession with personal hygiene. They required hot baths drawn in their bedchambers. They required pitchers of steaming water for shaving and washing their faces multiple times a day. This meant the lower servants had to haul hundreds of gallons of water up those same treacherous stairs. They carried massive copper jugs of boiling water, their muscles trembling under the strain, terrified of spilling a single drop on the expensive Persian carpets. The physical geometry of the townhouse was a weapon constantly working against the bodies of the people forced to maintain it. Yet, the fuel provided to keep these human engines running was staggeringly inadequate. There is a persistent myth that working in a wealthy household meant eating well, that the servants simply dined on the lavish leftovers of the masters. This is a bitter lie. The food in the basement was strictly, mercilessly rationed. The 12-course banquets of roast pheasant, buttered asparagus, and rich puddings prepared by the cook belonged exclusively to the dining room above. The leftovers were fiercely guarded by the housekeeper or sold out the back door by the cook for personal profit. Meat was a rarity, often restricted to a tough, boiled cut of mutton served once a week. Fresh vegetables were virtually non-existent. The lower servants operated in a permanent state of severe calorie deficit, burning thousands of calories hauling coal and water, while consuming little more than starch and animal grease. This toxic combination of extreme physical exertion and chronic malnutrition led to an epidemic of hidden, agonizing injuries. The most infamous of these was a condition doctors clinically and coldly referred to as housemaid's knee. Every single morning, before the masters awoke, the maids were required to scrub the grand stone steps at the front of the house. They did not use modern mops. They were forced to kneel on the freezing, wet stone and scrub it by hand using a block of soft, abrasive rock known as hearthstone. This daily, grinding pressure on the kneecaps caused the prepatellar bursa, the small sac of fluid cushioning the joint, to become severely inflamed. The knee would swell to the size of a large orange, filling with fluid and agonizing pressure. In a modern world, this requires rest and medical intervention. In 1888, it required silence. If a housemaid complained of the pain, or if the housekeeper noticed her limping as she carried the heavy breakfast trays, she would be instantly dismissed for physical incompetence. So the young women wrapped their swollen, throbbing knees in tight, filthy strips of linen, biting their tongues until they bled to keep from crying out as they knelt on the hard stone day after day. If the swollen bursa became infected, a highly common occurrence in the unsanitary conditions of the era, the resulting sepsis could easily lead to amputation or a slow, agonizing death in a charity hospital ward. Their spines curved prematurely from the relentless lifting. Their eyesight deteriorated rapidly from doing intricate mending and needlework in the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle late into the night. They suffered from chronic sleep deprivation, a legally enforced torture. The working day of a Victorian domestic servant was widely documented to span between 14 and 18 hours. They were the first to wake before the sun rose, and the absolute last to sleep after the master's final glass of brandy was cleared away. They had no weekends. They were typically granted only one half-day off a week, and even that was subject to immediate cancellation if the mistress decided to host an impromptu dinner party. The biological destruction was so profound that a domestic servant of 25 often possessed the ruined, hollowed-out body of a woman in her late 40s. Their youth was entirely consumed, burned as fuel to keep the great, glowing fires of the aristocratic lifestyle roaring. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question. If a machine made of iron breaks down, the factory owner simply orders a replacement part from the foundry. But when a machine made of flesh and bone finally shatters under the impossible weight of its duties, where does it go to rust? The upper classes possessed a terrifying ability to simply erase the broken people from their vision. When a maid's back finally gave out, or when a footman developed a persistent, bloody cough from the damp cellar, there was no severance pay. There was no pension. There was no medical care offered by the master's expensive private physician. The broken servant was simply handed their final meager wages, denied a character reference due to their physical failing, and shown the back door. They were cast out into a city that had no safety net, entirely used up and utterly disposable. The charity hospitals, like Guy's or St. Thomas's, were overflowing with former domestic servants, their bodies ravaged by diseases born of exhaustion and damp. Those who could not secure a hospital bed faced a much darker, faster decline. Unable to perform physical labor, they were evicted from their cheap lodging houses. They joined the sprawling, invisible army of the destitute, wandering the labyrinthine streets of the metropolis. They traded the claustrophobic terror of the wealthy basement for the sprawling, open-air nightmare of the London slums. It is late August 1888. The suffocating summer heat is finally beginning to break, replaced by a damp, creeping chill that rises from the black waters of the River Thames. The gas lamps hiss loudly in the early evening gloom. For the wealthy families safe inside their fortified townhouses, the changing of the season merely means ordering the servants to light the heavy fires in the drawing rooms. But for the women who have been broken by the machine, the women who have been cast out of the basements with ruined knees, curved spines, and empty pockets, the coming autumn brings a terror unlike anything the city has ever known. Because out there, in the twisting, fog-choked alleys of Whitechapel, a profound darkness is waiting. The streets are overflowing with vulnerable, desperate women discarded by polite society. They are standing in the shadows, trying to sell whatever is left of their ruined bodies just to survive the freezing night. And a monster with a long, impossibly sharp blade is about to step out of the fog, ready to show the Grand British Empire exactly what happens to the human machines it throws away. It is the 31st of August, 1888. The dark, sprawling beast of London is about to wake up to a nightmare that will permanently scar the history of the world. In the narrow, filthy confines of Bucks Row, Whitechapel, a carman walking to work in the pitch black of the early morning stumbles upon a crumpled shape on the damp cobblestones. It is the mutilated body of Mary and Nichols. The newspapers will soon call the invisible predator Jack the Ripper. But to the terrified women scrubbing the stone steps of the grand townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia, this nameless monster represents something far more profound than a simple ghost story. He is the ultimate, bloody consequence of failure. Mary and Nichols, like so many of the women who will fall beneath the killer's blade that autumn, was not born onto the streets. She had once worn the coarse cotton uniform of a domestic servant. She had once stood in a warm kitchen. She had once possessed a character reference. But she had fallen out of the system. She had lost her footing on the razor-thin wire of Victorian morality and employment, and gravity had pulled her down into the abyss of the East End. When the newsboys begin running down the pristine, sweeping avenues of the West End, shouting the gruesome, unprecedented details of the Whitechapel murders, the sound penetrates the thick glass windows of the wealthy estates. It bleeds down the servants' stairs. It echoes in the damp basements. The autumn of terror has begun. For the aristocratic masters and mistresses sitting comfortably in their velvet-lined drawing rooms, the murders in the East End are a thrilling, scandalous, morbid curiosity. The morning papers arrive neatly pressed and folded on polished silver salvers, carried by silent footmen. The wealthy read the horrific details over plates of buttered toast and softly boiled eggs. They debate the identity of the killer with their guests over crystal glasses of sherry. To the upper classes, the slaughter in the slums is simply another gruesome entertainment, a grim confirmation of their deeply held belief that the lower classes are inherently savage, animalistic, and utterly devoid of God. They feel perfectly safe behind their towering brick walls and heavy iron gates. But for the women trapped in the basement, the terror is absolute, paralyzing, and intensely personal. When the scullery maid sneaks a terrifying glance at the discarded penny paper in the kitchen bin, she does not see a sensationalized story. She sees a terrifying mirror. She looks at the crude ink sketches of the victims and recognizes the sunken eyes and the exhausted, prematurely aged faces. She knows with absolute, chilling certainty that the only thing separating her from the cold, blood-soaked cobblestones of Whitechapel is the capricious temper of the housekeeper and the fragile piece of paper hidden in her wooden trunk. If a heavy iron pot slips from her raw, blistered hands and shatters on the kitchen floor, she will be dismissed without a character. She will be turned out the back door into the creeping yellow fog, and the shadow with the long, thin blade will be waiting for her. This psychological shockwave profoundly altered the delicate, tyrannical ecosystem of the Victorian townhouse. The invisible predator stalking the East End inadvertently became the most effective, terrifying tool of subjugation the wealthy masters could have ever engineered. Before the autumn of 1888, a fiercely mistreated housemaid might occasionally dare to talk back. She might threaten to pack her meager belongings and risk finding a new position in a kinder household. But as the leaves turned brown and the body count in Whitechapel steadily rose with the brutal slayings of Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, the whispers of rebellion in the servants' hall abruptly died. The outside world had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous than the suffocating cruelty of the basement. The fear of being cast out paralyzed the entire domestic workforce. The upper servants, the ruthless enforcers of the master's will, understood this dynamic immediately. They weaponized the terror. The housekeeper did not need to explicitly mention the murders or shout at the lower staff. She simply needed to slowly turn the heavy brass deadbolt on the back door at night, ensuring the loud, metallic click echoed heavily down the stone hallway. She would look coldly at the young, trembling tweenie who had forgotten to polish the copper kettles properly, and casually remind her how cold the streets were getting. She would remind the girl how terribly dangerous it was for a young woman to wander the city alone without a respectable roof over her head. It was a devastating, silent threat. Obey, submit, endure every humiliation, or I will feed you to the monster in the fog. This environment of heightened, inescapable fear forced the lower servants to accept conditions they might have otherwise violently rejected. The physical destruction of their bodies, the endless, agonizing hours of manual labor, and the deliberate starvation rations were suddenly viewed as a necessary, acceptable price to pay for the simple privilege of a locked door. The basement, with its damp walls and freezing drafts, transformed in their minds from a prison into a heavily fortified bunker. The terror seeped into the very architecture of the house. The Victorian townhouse, built with labyrinthine corridors and deeply shadowed stairwells, suddenly felt incredibly sinister. The coal cellars of these grand mansions often extended directly underneath the public pavements. As the scullery maid descended into the pitch-black cellar to fill her heavy iron buckets, she could hear the muffled footsteps of the pedestrians walking on the stone pavement right above her head. In the autumn of 1888, every single heavy footstep echoing through the ceiling sounded like the heavy boots of a killer hunting in the fog. The psychological toll of this constant, grinding fear, layered on top of their severe physical exhaustion, pushed many young women to the absolute brink of mental collapse. But this heavy brass deadbolt on the back door created a terrifying paradox. It kept the visible monster out, but it trapped the women inside with predators of a completely different nature. Because society was entirely fixated on the gruesome, public violence of the East End, a profound, suffocating silence fell over the quiet, devastating violence occurring inside the pristine mansions of the West End. The upper classes convinced themselves that their homes were absolute sanctuaries of virtue and Christian safety. But the domestic servant knew that danger did not always carry a butcher knife in a dark, muddy alley. Sometimes, danger wore a bespoke silk dressing gown and smelled of expensive Cuban cigars. If the monster outside only preys on the discarded, vulnerable women of the lower class, is the locked door of the basement truly keeping the terror out, or is it simply locking the helpless servant in with her abusers? The intense vulnerability of the female servants during this period cannot be overstated. They were legally bound to obey the masters of the house. They were physically isolated from their families and their agricultural communities. And now, terrified of the horrific violence in the streets, they were completely, utterly trapped within the walls of their employment. They had nowhere to run. This created an environment incredibly ripe for a deeply hidden, systemic form of exploitation. The gentlemen of the house, the wealthy patriarchs and their privileged, arrogant sons, were acutely aware of the absolute power they held over the young women dusting their massive libraries and making their soft beds. They knew that a maid would endure almost any indignity, rather than risk being thrown out into the terrifying, deadly streets of late Victorian London. The young women migrating from the countryside to work in the grand estates were often astonishingly naive, entirely unprepared for the complex, predatory dynamics of the aristocratic home. They were taught by their local vicars and their impoverished parents that the wealthy were inherently noble, chosen by God to lead and protect the lower classes. They expected strict discipline, but they expected it to be administered with a sense of paternal, moral duty. But the reality of the London townhouse shattered this illusion with brutal, silent efficiency. As the winter approached and the yellow fog thickened, pressing heavily against the glass panes of the tall, narrow windows, the isolation inside the grand houses became absolute. The masters retreated indoors, spending their long evenings drinking port by the roaring fires, completely separated from the icy misery of the city outside. And in this enclosed, highly pressurized environment, the strict, formal boundaries between the untouchable master and the invisible servant began to blur in the most dangerous, destructive ways imaginable. The police and the newspapers of the day were entirely consumed by the hunt for the madman in Whitechapel. The authorities scoured the slums, kicking down doors and interrogating thousands of desperate men in the cheap lodging houses. The entire machinery of the British Empire was focused on stopping the slaughter of the poorest women in the capital. Yet, absolutely no one was looking at the silent, psychological slaughter happening behind the heavy oak doors of the richest streets in the world. No one was listening to the muffled weeping in the freezing attic rooms, or noticing the terrified, downcast eyes of the young housemaid as she nervously poured tea for the master's eldest son. The true tragedy of the autumn of 1888 was not just the blood spilled on the cobblestones. It was the heavy, suffocating blanket of fear it threw over the women who were already struggling to survive in the shadows. The serial killer in the East End effectively became the invisible warden of the West End basements, ensuring that no matter how terrible the abuses became inside the home, the women would never dare to run away. They were trapped in a vice, the threat of violent death on the outside, and the reality of silent, devastating exploitation on the inside. As the freezing winds battered the iron railings of the wealthy estates, the female servants were forced to navigate a harrowing path of survival, guarding their physical bodies against the grueling mechanical labor of the day, and guarding their very souls against the quiet, predatory footsteps that echoed in the dark corridors long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. Listen to the absolute silence of the Victorian townhouse at 2 a.m. The fires in the grand drawing rooms have burned down to glowing embers. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the creeping London fog. On the top floor, beneath the sloping slate roof, lies the servants' attic. The air up here is freezing, smelling of damp plaster and cheap carbolic soap. Look closely at the heavy wooden door of the maid's bedroom. It is a sturdy piece of timber, built to keep the drafts out. But if you examine the heavy iron lock mechanism, you will notice a terrifying architectural detail. The keyhole is only on the outside. The maid cannot lock herself in. She can only be locked in by others, or left entirely exposed to anyone holding the master key. As the young woman lies shivering beneath a thin wool blanket, her exhausted muscles aching from carrying tons of coal and boiling water, she hears it. A slow, deliberate creak on the wooden floorboards of the corridor. The heavy, measured footsteps of a man who does not need to hide. The brass handle of her door slowly turns. This was the unspoken, devastating reality of domestic service in 1888. The young women who scrubbed the floors and emptied the chamber pots were entirely captive to the whims of the men who owned the house. They were stripped of their social defenses, legally bound to obey, and isolated from any family who might protect them. To enforce complete dedication to the household, the Victorian upper classes imposed a draconian rule upon their female staff. No followers allowed. This meant a maid was strictly forbidden from having a suitor, a boyfriend, or even a male friend walk her home from church. Any romantic attachment was viewed by the housekeeper as a dangerous distraction from her grueling duties. If a maid was caught simply speaking to a baker's boy at the iron railings, she faced immediate dismissal. This enforced, unnatural celibacy created an environment of profound emotional starvation. Tens of thousands of young girls migrated from the agricultural shires to the blinding gaslights of London every year. They were often 14 or 15 years old, entirely alone in a massive, roaring metropolis. They were subjected to daily verbal abuse, crushing manual labor, and terrible food. They were desperately lonely. They hungered for a single kind word, a gentle look, any small validation that they were human beings and not just biological machines. This overwhelming emotional vulnerability made them perfect prey. The gentlemen of the house, the wealthy patriarchs and particularly their privileged, arrogant sons, viewed the female servants as readily available property. The strict moral codes of Victorian high society demanded that aristocratic women remain utterly pure, ignorant of physical intimacy until their wedding night. But the men of the upper classes were quietly encouraged to gain experience before marriage. While many sought this experience in the sprawling, dangerous brothels of Soho and Covent Garden, others found it much closer to home, requiring merely a short walk up the unlit servants' stairs. The power dynamic was absolute and terrifying. When the master or the young gentleman entered the freezing attic room in the dead of night, the maid could not scream. If she cried out and woke the house, the blame would fall entirely upon her. The deeply entrenched misogyny and class prejudice of the era dictated that a gentleman could not possibly be at fault. The assumption would instantly be that the maid, a lower-class woman inherently viewed as morally corrupt and sexually aggressive, had wickedly tempted her social superior. She could not refuse him, because he controlled her access to food, shelter, and the vital character reference she needed to survive. So she endured it in total, agonizing silence, staring blindly at the cracked ceiling while the man who paid her wages took whatever he wanted. The next morning, she would have to carry his breakfast tray into the dining room, keep her eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, and pour his hot tea with hands that were not allowed to tremble. For the men, these nighttime excursions were utterly consequence-free, a fleeting amusement quickly forgotten over a morning cigar. But for the young maid, the consequences were a ticking time bomb of absolute destruction. The greatest terror in the basement was the sudden cessation of a monthly cycle. Pregnancy was the ultimate, inescapable death sentence for a domestic servant. The desperation of a pregnant maid is a profound tragedy of human endurance. For months, she would wage a terrifying, silent war against her own changing body. She would pull the laces of her coarse cotton corset so violently tight that the steel boning bit deeply into her ribs, desperately trying to flatten the growing swell of her stomach. She would volunteer for the heaviest, most grueling physical labor, secretly hauling extra scuttles of coal or throwing herself down the stone stairs in the dark, praying for the physical trauma to induce a miscarriage. She lived every single second of the day in a state of paralyzing panic, terrified of the morning sickness that could betray her to the sharp, unforgiving eyes of the housekeeper. But biology cannot be hidden forever. Eventually, the housekeeper would notice the physical exhaustion, the thickening waist, the quiet, desperate weeping in the scullery. The retribution was swift, absolute, and merciless. A pregnant servant was considered a severe moral contagion, a filthy stain upon the pristine reputation of the aristocratic home. She was stripped of her uniform immediately. Her meager belongings were thrown into her wooden trunk. She was dragged to the back door and cast out onto the cold pavement, completely regardless of the weather or the hour. She was, of course, denied a character reference. And if she dared to name the master or his son as the father, she was called a vicious, blackmailing liar and threatened with the police. The law offered her absolutely no protection. In fact, the legal system was explicitly engineered to shield the wealthy men from any accountability. The Bastardy Laws Amendment Act of 1872 placed the agonizing burden of illegitimate children almost entirely on the shoulders of the ruined mothers. If a woman miraculously managed to drag her wealthy abuser into a magistrate's court, the law demanded corroborating evidence of his paternity. But how could an isolated servant, locked in a dark attic at 2 a.m, possibly provide a credible witness? It was a legal impossibility. Even if she somehow won, the maximum maintenance the court could force the father to pay was a miserable 5 shillings a week, an insulting sum that barely covered the cost of bread. If a society enacts laws that explicitly protect the predator while completely annihilating the prey, can that society truly call itself civilized? The discarded, heavily pregnant servant faced a terrifying descent. Unable to secure work without a reference, her meager savings vanished within weeks. She was inevitably forced into the towering, nightmarish brick walls of the workhouse maternity ward. These wards were little more than charnel houses, places of rampant infection and staggering infant mortality. The women gave birth in agonizing pain on narrow iron beds, surrounded by the moans of dozens of other ruined girls. If she and the child miraculously survived the workhouse, she faced an impossible choice. She could not work as a wet nurse or a factory girl while caring for an infant. To avoid starving to death together on the streets, thousands of desperate mothers turned to the darkest, most horrific underground industry of the Victorian era: the baby farmers. For a lump sum of a few pounds, or a weekly payment she would drain her own blood to meet, a woman would hand her newborn child over to a stranger who promised a warm home and loving care. But the vast majority of these baby farmers were ruthless, cold-blooded killers. They took the desperate mother's money, and then intentionally starved the infants to death, drugging them into silence with cheap opium syrups like Godfrey's cordial until they simply stopped breathing. The tiny bodies were buried in shallow backyard graves, or thrown into the freezing, dark waters of the River Thames in the dead of night. The blood of those nameless infants stained the hands of the wealthy masters who had climbed the servants' stairs in the dark. But the masters never saw the consequences. They continued to attend their grand balls, deliver their pompous speeches in Parliament, and present themselves as the absolute pinnacle of human morality. The maids who managed to avoid the devastating trap of pregnancy, who survived the predatory advances and the crushing physical labor, understood that their survival depended entirely on their own cunning. They realized that absolute loyalty to a system that treated them as disposable meat was a fool's errand. If the masters would not protect them, they had to protect themselves. If they were paid starvation wages to perform the work of 10 men, they had to find another way to balance the scales. They could not rely on the law. They could not rely on charity. They had to rely on the sprawling, shadowy economy of the basement. They turned to the only resources they had direct access to: the incredible, staggering waste of the wealthy. They learned how to turn the discarded refuse of the masters into the vital currency of their own survival, building an entire underground economy out of scraps, grease, and shadows. Walk into the grand dining room of a Mayfair mansion at midnight, long after the wealthy guests have retired to the smoking room and the velvet curtains have been drawn against the London fog. The long mahogany table is a battlefield of astonishing, staggering excess. You will see half-eaten joints of expensive roasted meats left entirely to rot. You will see crystal decanters still heavy with imported French claret and vintage ruby port. You will see towering, pure beeswax candles, burned down a mere inch, snuffed out simply because the evening has ended. To the aristocratic masters of the house, this staggering waste is completely invisible. It is merely the expected debris of a successful, elegant evening. But to the men and women observing from the shadows of the servants' corridor, this discarded debris is a vital, untaxed currency. In the grueling, subterranean world of 1888 London, physical survival could not be sustained on the miserable, starvation wages paid by the upper classes. A scullery maid making £10 a year could not afford to buy a warm winter coat, nor could she send enough money back to keep her impoverished family from the workhouse doors. The formal economy of the Victorian home was a deliberate trap, mathematically designed to keep the servant perpetually dependent and entirely chained to the basement. Therefore, The lower classes were forced to become masters of the informal economy. They built an entire, thriving black market out of the monumental arrogance and waste of the people they served. This was the shadow economy of scraps, and it was governed by an unspoken, fiercely contested set of rules known as the perquisites. The perquisites, or perks, were the traditional rights of the domestic servants to claim the leftover materials of the household. The wealthy masters increasingly viewed these claims as a dangerous, slippery slope toward outright, rampant theft. The servants viewed them as a fundamental, non-negotiable right of survival. The front line of this bitter, daily war was drawn directly across the stone floor of the kitchen. And the undisputed, terrifying queen of this black market was the cook. In an era decades before the invention of the electric refrigerator, preserving fresh meat was a constant, desperate battle. But the byproduct of cooking that massive volume of meat was liquid gold. When giant joints of beef or pork were roasted on heavy iron spits before the roaring kitchen fires, they released a thick, rich animal fat known as dripping. For the poorest, starving classes of London, dripping was a vital, calorie-dense substitute for butter. It was smeared thick on stale bread to provide the essential energy needed to survive the freezing, damp winters of the capital. By long-standing, fiercely defended tradition, the dripping belonged entirely to the cook. She collected it in heavy earthenware jars, hiding it in the darkest, coolest corners of her pantry. Once a week, she would smuggle these greasy jars out the heavy wooden back door, selling them to shadowy middlemen or directly to the starving poor in the narrow alleys of the East End. The profit from the dripping trade was staggering. It frequently doubled, or even tripled, the cook's official annual wages. But the mistresses of the house were painfully aware of this highly lucrative trade. They knew perfectly well that a corrupt, enterprising cook would intentionally order far more meat from the butcher than the family could ever possibly consume, specifically to generate a massive surplus of dripping. The cook would intentionally over-roast the incredibly expensive cuts of prime beef, literally melting away the master's wealth into the iron pan to line her own pockets. This sparked a relentless, psychological war of attrition between the lady of the house and the basement. The mistress would attempt to meticulously weigh the raw, bloody meat as it arrived from the butcher, mathematically calculating exactly how much fat should be legally produced. The cook would fight back with 100 different acts of subtle culinary sabotage, ruining the pastry or threatening to walk out the door moments before a vital, high-society dinner party if her traditional rights were aggressively challenged. This silent, vicious war extended far beyond the heat of the kitchen. It permeated every single level of the strict basement hierarchy. Upstairs, the grand drawing rooms and sweeping staircases were illuminated by hundreds of candles. The wealthy demanded the exclusive use of pure beeswax or the newly invented spermaceti wax, extracted from the heads of sperm whales. These luxury candles burned bright, clean, and entirely without the foul, choking, slaughterhouse odor of the cheap tallow candles used down in the servants' quarters. It was an unwritten, ironclad rule of Victorian high society that a candle, once lit for guests, could never be relit for a second evening. It was considered a gross, humiliating display of middle-class penny-pinching. Therefore, when the masters went up to their warm beds, the butler and the footmen would immediately extinguish the flames. They harvested the long, unburned stubs of highly expensive wax. These stubs were an incredibly valuable black market commodity. The butler would hoard them in secret wooden boxes, later selling them to a vast network of illicit dealers who melted the wax down to manufacture fresh candles for the aspiring middle classes. The butler also controlled the heavy iron keys to the vast, dusty wine cellars. When a bottle of expensive champagne or vintage port was opened for the master's dining table, it was rarely drained to the bottom. The butler would carefully decant the remaining alcohol into his own private bottles. He would consume it himself in the locked sanctuary of the pug's parlor, or he would sell it to unscrupulous tavern owners in the city. He even hoarded the discarded corks, selling them by the sack to the local apothecary to be shaved down and reused for medicine bottles. Nothing was wasted. Every single byproduct of the aristocratic lifestyle was ruthlessly and efficiently monetized by the people forced to maintain it. To facilitate this massive, sprawling underground economy, a specialized breed of merchant evolved in the foggy, dangerous streets of London. They were known as the marine store dealers. Officially, these dealers held licenses to buy and sell scrap metal, rags, and used maritime equipment. In reality, They were the willing, silent fences for the stolen goods of the affluent West End basements. They operated out of grimy, unlit shopfronts tucked away in the narrow, labyrinthine alleys just beyond the pristine residential squares. They arrived at the tradesmen's entrance of the grand townhouses at the break of dawn, pushing heavy wooden handcarts through the freezing yellow fog. They spoke in hushed, conspiratorial tones, trading heavy silver coins for sacks of dripping, wooden boxes of wax, and massive bundles of discarded linen. They also purchased the most intimate, highly dangerous byproduct of the aristocratic home: the ashes. Every single morning before sunrise, the maids had to clean the massive iron grates of the drawing-room fireplaces. They swept up mountains of fine gray ash and unburned pieces of coal. But these ashes often contained far more than just burned wood. They contained the silver hairpins that fell from the mistress's hair. They contained the tiny, dropped gold buttons from the master's waistcoats. Sometimes they contained half-burned, highly compromising letters, discarded gambling debts, or torn legal documents. The bone grubbers and ashmen who bought this refuse for pennies would meticulously sift through the dirt with their bare, blackened hands, extracting every single piece of valuable metal or readable paper. The grand houses of London were literally bleeding their deepest secrets into the gutters. The wealthy mistresses lived in a permanent, gnawing state of paranoia. They knew they were being bled dry by the invisible people living beneath their own floorboards, but they were entirely dependent upon them. They could not cook their own food. They could not light their own fires. They were helpless, ignorant hostages in their own towering castles. To combat this relentless, invisible theft, the Victorian upper classes turned to a desperate, highly visible architectural defense. They began locking absolutely everything away. The mistress of the house walked through the carpeted corridors accompanied by the heavy, metallic clinking of the chatelaine. The chatelaine was a decorative, heavily ornate silver clip worn entirely at the waist, from which hung a sprawling series of small, intricate keys. These keys were the absolute symbols of her authority and her profound fear. She locked the heavy mahogany tea caddies, guarding the expensive imported Indian and Ceylon tea leaves as if they were diamonds. She locked the sugar bowls, the exotic spice cabinets, and the massive wooden linen presses. She treated her servants not as loyal, human employees, but as a hostile, occupying army that had to be constantly starved of resources. But heavy iron locks are only effective if the people guarding them are not themselves starving. The servants possessed an infinite amount of time and a desperate, burning motivation. They learned how to gently pry the brass hinges off the locked tea caddies without ever disturbing the intricate front locks. They learned how to skim the thick cream from the top of the morning milk jugs, replacing the stolen volume with a splash of dirty water. They learned how to lightly rub the edges of the heavy silver spoons with abrasive sand, collecting the microscopic silver dust in small leather pouches over the course of decades. Did they feel guilty for this endless, systemic theft? Absolutely not. To the exhausted men and women of the basement, this was not a crime. It was a perfectly justified, profoundly moral tax levied against an oppressive, hypocritical system. They were forced to work up to 18 hours a day, ruining their spines and destroying their knees to maintain the impossible, ridiculous vanity of the upper classes. They were paid starvation wages that virtually guaranteed they would die on the cold floor of a workhouse if they ever fell seriously ill. They watched their masters casually discard more wealth in a single evening than a scullery maid would earn in her entire grueling lifetime. The theft was a survival mechanism. It was a desperate, psychological rebalancing of the scales. Every stolen ounce of sugar, every smuggled jar of beef dripping, was a tiny, silent victory against the towering, crushing weight of the Victorian class system. Yet, this underground economy also bound the servants together in a highly complex web of complicity and mutual destruction. The lower servants deeply resented the massive, untaxed profits made by the cook and the butler. The scullery maid, entirely locked out of the lucrative trade in wax and wine, was reduced to selling the dirty, greasy rags she used to polish the floors, receiving only miserable pennies for her grueling labor. The basement was a fiercely competitive, ruthless marketplace, perfectly echoing the brutal, unforgiving capitalism of the sprawling city above. Despite the internal warfare, this shadowy economy provided the one vital thing the masters desperately tried to deny their workers: autonomy. The few extra silver shillings earned from the marine store dealer in the early morning fog were not locked away in a bank. They were hoarded, hidden under loose wooden floorboards or stitched tightly into the hems of scratchy wool skirts. They represented a tiny, precious sliver of independence. Those heavily guarded coins meant the absolute difference between sheer, suicidal despair and the fragile, intoxicating illusion of freedom. Because even the most perfectly engineered biological machine needs a moment to breathe. The crushing, relentless cycle of work, the endless carrying of boiling water, the agonizing scrubbing of stone, and the terrifying navigation of the master's unpredictable tempers could not be sustained continuously without the human mind shattering completely. The servants endured 6 days of profound physical and psychological annihilation for the promise of a single, brief window of light. As the harsh, brutal week finally ground to a halt, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the basement would imperceptibly shift. The hidden coins were carefully unstitched from the hems. The exhausted faces were scrubbed clean with cold, freezing water. The worn, heavily mended leather boots were frantically polished to a shine. They were preparing for the most sacred, desperate ritual of the Victorian working class. They were preparing to step out of the dark, suffocating basement, out into the sprawling, dangerous streets of London, and pretend, if only for a few fleeting hours, that they were finally truly free. Listen to the sound of London on a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1888. The relentless, deafening roar of the iron drays and the shouted curses of the street hawkers have momentarily faded. In their place, the heavy, mournful tolling of church bells rolls across the smog-choked skyline. Inside the grand townhouses of Mayfair, an unnatural, highly fragile silence descends. The heavy silver dining sets have been cleared away from the midday roast. The masters and mistresses have retired to their drawing rooms for a designated period of Christian reflection, or simply to sleep off the heavy claret. And down in the freezing, damp basement, a frantic, desperate transformation is taking place. For the domestic servant, Sunday was not a day of rest. It was a day of accelerated, agonizing labor in the morning, entirely dedicated to earning the single most precious commodity in the Victorian working-class world: the half-day off. By custom, though absolutely never by law, a servant was granted a few fleeting hours of freedom every other Sunday afternoon, and perhaps one evening a month. The Bank Holidays Act of 1871 had granted official, legal days of rest to the clerks and the factory workers of the British Empire, but the domestic servant was deliberately and entirely excluded. The law did not recognize their exhaustion. Their rest was not a right. It was a highly conditional privilege, one that could be instantly revoked by a bad-tempered housekeeper or an unexpected aristocratic guest arriving at the front door. If they managed to secure their release, the ensuing 4 hours were a frantic, heartbreaking exercise in mimicry. Watch the young housemaid in the dim light of her attic room. She strips off the coarse, scratchy print dress and the heavy, stained canvas apron that marks her as a beast of burden. She reaches into the very bottom of her wooden trunk and pulls out her Sunday best. It is a desperate, moving illusion. The dress is likely second-hand, purchased from a marine store dealer, or painstakingly stitched together from discarded scraps of velvet and cheap cotton. It mimics the grand, sweeping silhouettes of the wealthy women upstairs, but the fabric is thin, and the seams are desperately frayed. She pins a cheap, imitation feathered hat to her hair. She is terrified of looking like a servant. The rigid class system of 1888 London demanded that everyone instantly recognize their social superiors and inferiors simply by the cut of their cloth. On her half-day off, the maid wants nothing more than to walk the streets and be mistaken, just for an hour, for a respectable shop girl or a clerk's wife. She wants to be visible. She wants to cast a shadow. As the heavy back door clicks shut behind her, she steps out into the crisp, biting autumn air. She is free, but this freedom is tightly bound by an invisible, suffocating tether. The ticking of the great-grandfather clock in the front hall of the townhouse follows her everywhere she goes. The curfew for a female servant on her day off was absolute and completely unforgiving. She had to be back down in the basement by 9 or 10 o'clock at night, depending on the tyranny of the housekeeper. If she returned 5 minutes late, the heavy wooden door would be bolted shut. She would be locked out in the freezing night, instantly dismissed without a character reference, her life entirely ruined for the crime of losing track of time. Where did they go with these precious, terrifying hours? They could not afford the grand music halls of the West End or the expensive tea shops of Piccadilly. Instead, they flooded the sprawling green lungs of the city. Hyde Park, Regent's Park, and St. James's Park became the vibrant, desperately crowded sanctuaries of the domestic workforce. Thousands of young men and women in their cheap, brightly colored Sunday clothes promenade along the gravel paths. They walked arm in arm, laughing loudly, shedding the enforced, monastic silence of the grand houses. They sat on the cold wooden benches, eating cheap roasted chestnuts bought from street braziers, and breathed in air that did not smell of caustic soda or boiling cabbage. It was here, amidst the fading autumn leaves, that the strict, terrifying rule against followers was briefly, recklessly broken. The parks were the underground marriage markets of the working class. Footmen in their civilian clothes courted parlor maids. Lifeguardsmen from the local barracks, resplendent in their bright red tunics, flirted heavily with the terrified, exhilarated girls fresh from the agricultural countryside. For a few hours, they were not biological machines. They were young, they were human, and they were desperately searching for a connection that the basement entirely denied them. But the parks were not just sanctuaries of romance. They were hunting grounds. The gentlemen of the upper classes, the very men these women served, knew exactly where the maids went on their days off. They would stroll through the parks on a Sunday afternoon, leaning heavily on their silver-tipped canes, watching the desperate, incredibly vulnerable girls in their cheap finery. The men understood the brutal mathematics of the servant's existence. They knew these girls were emotionally starved, chronically exhausted, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of wealthy men. A kind word, a softly spoken compliment, or the offer of a hot cup of tea in a warm tavern could easily shatter the defenses of a lonely, freezing 15-year-old girl who had not heard her own first name spoken with affection in years. The path from the gravel walks of Hyde Park to the blood-soaked cobblestones of Whitechapel was terrifyingly short. In the shadows of the 1888 autumn, the danger was amplified 1,000-fold. The Ripper was hunting in the east, but the wealthy predators of the West End were equally lethal, destroying lives not with a blade, but with a false promise and a locked bedroom door. If you are only permitted to exist as yourself for 4 hours a week, constantly terrified of the ticking clock and hunted by the very men who rule your city, are you a living human being, or merely a ghost on temporary leave? As the sun begins to set over the sprawling metropolis, the gas lamps flicker to life, casting long, sinister shadows across the park lawns. The panic sets in. The invisible tether yanks hard. The thousands of servants abruptly stop laughing. They check the cheap tin pocket watches they bought from pawnshops. They begin the frantic, desperate rush back to the wealthy residential squares. They run through the darkening streets, their chests heaving, terrified of the heavy brass deadbolt clicking shut before they can reach the tradesman's entrance. When the maid finally scrambles down the steep, treacherous stone steps and pushes through the basement door, the psychological whiplash is devastating. She strips off the cheap, beautiful Sunday dress. She carefully folds the imitation feathered hat and places it back into the dark wooden trunk. She ties the heavy canvas apron back around her waist. The brief, intoxicating illusion of humanity is instantly extinguished. She is a machine once again. The kitchen is freezing. The cook is screaming about the preparations for the Monday morning breakfast. The mountain of dirty copper pots is already piling up in the scullery sink. The contrast between the bright, open air of the park and the claustrophobic, damp terror of the basement was enough to break the minds of many young workers. The sheer exhaustion of trying to cram an entire week of living, of hoping, and of breathing into 4 desperate hours left them more depleted than the physical labor itself. They survived on the memory of the park, counting the agonizing 14 days until they could briefly step out into the light once more. But as the native English servants silently endured this crushing cycle of brief hope and prolonged despair, there was another group within the grand townhouses who watched them leave for the parks with a profound, bitter envy. For all the suffering of the local girls migrating from the shires, they at least shared the language, the religion, and the skin color of their oppressors. They were the invisible citizens of the empire. But hidden even deeper within the labyrinthine corridors of the Victorian basement were the outsiders. The immigrants. The Irish refugees fleeing starvation, the French chefs navigating a hostile kitchen, and the dark-skinned servants brought back from the farthest, most brutal colonial reaches of the British Empire. For them, the heavy back door of the townhouse did not open to a park of friends and laughter. It opened to a city that viewed them with absolute, terrifying hostility. Imagine traveling thousands of miles across violent, churning oceans, leaving behind the blazing heat of the Indian subcontinent or the lush, emerald hills of a starving Ireland, only to end your journey locked inside a freezing, windowless cellar beneath the streets of London. You are entirely surrounded by a city that rules the known world, yet you are not permitted to speak its language above a whisper. You are the ultimate outsider. In the grand, sweeping narrative of the Victorian era, the English domestic servant is often portrayed as a tragic, exploited figure. But beneath them, occupying an even darker, more suffocating circle of this subterranean hell, were the immigrants. They were the men and women whose very skin, accent, and origin made them targets of a brutal, double-edged cruelty. The British Empire in 1888 was at the absolute zenith of its global power. The wealthy elite viewed the entire planet as a vast, personal catalog from which they could order exotic goods, rare spices, and human beings. But the importation of foreign labor created a toxic, deeply fractured environment within the already terrifying hierarchy of the servants' hall. Following the devastating famines of the mid-19th century, hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants flooded into the London metropolis, desperately seeking any means of survival to avoid starvation. By the late 1880s, young Irish girls formed a massive, highly exploited underclass within the domestic workforce. But when they knocked on the heavy oak doors of the West End employment agencies, they were frequently met with a chilling, ubiquitous instruction written plainly on the glass windows. No Irish need apply. To secure a position as a lowly scullery maid, an Irish girl often had to lie, scrubbing away her thick, melodic accent and adopting a submissive, broken English imitation just to get past the front door. She had to hide her Catholic faith, burying her rosary beads deep at the bottom of her wooden trunk, terrified that the fiercely Protestant housekeeper would discover them and throw her out into the street for religious heresy. Once inside the basement, the hostility was absolute and unrelenting. The English servants, themselves heavily oppressed and brutalized by the masters above, desperately needed someone to look down upon to soothe their own bruised dignity. They found their perfect, defenseless victims in the Irish girls. The basement was a miniature reflection of the British Empire itself, ruthlessly replicating the colonial hierarchy right next to the roaring kitchen fire. If a heavy iron coal scuttle needed to be carried up 5 flights of treacherous stairs, the English housemaid would seamlessly delegate the agonizing labor to the Irish tweenie. The Irish servants were assigned the most degrading, physically destructive tasks, systematically bullied and isolated by the very people who shared their grueling poverty. But the Irish at least shared a similar complexion with their tormentors. For the dark-skinned servants brought to London from the furthest, most brutal reaches of the empire, the isolation was an inescapable, highly visible physical reality. The Victorian elite treated colonial servants not as human employees, but as exotic, living ornaments. Wealthy families returning from the British Raj in India frequently brought back Indian nannies, known as ayahs, to care for their fair-haired children during the long, arduous sea voyages. The visual contrast was highly prized as an aristocratic status symbol. The masters loved to parade their ayahs through the manicured, pristine lawns of Hyde Park. The image of the ayah, draped in vibrant, flowing silk saris, standing starkly against the gray, soot-stained backdrop of the London fog, silently demonstrated the vast, global reach of the master's personal wealth and imperial dominance. But the moment the children outgrew the nursery and no longer required a nanny, the ornamental value of the ayah abruptly expired. The wealthy families simply discarded them. They dismissed these women without return passage, casting servants who spoke absolutely no English out into the freezing, hostile fog of a sprawling city they did not understand. In the late 19th century, London possessed specialized, squalid boarding houses near the East End docks specifically overflowing with abandoned ayahs. These women sat shivering in the damp, freezing rooms, starving and desperately begging the ship captains for a return ticket to a home they would likely never see again. They were stripped of their dignity, entirely unprotected by the laws of the very empire that had stolen them from their families. If an empire measures its supreme civilization by the exotic humans it collects as living trophies, what does it mean when it leaves those same trophies to starve in the freezing gutters of its own capital? Yet, in this complex, deeply prejudiced underground world, nationality could also be weaponized for absolute supremacy. Consider the bizarre, terrifying paradox of the French chef. While the Irish scullery maid was deliberately starved and the Indian ayah was casually discarded, the male French chef was the undisputed, tyrannical dictator of the wealthy kitchen. High society in 1888 was utterly obsessed with European continental elegance. A British cook was considered adequate for a quiet family dinner, but a French chef was a soaring, undeniable symbol of aristocratic sophistication. These men were paid astronomical wages, sometimes commanding well over £100 a year, a staggering sum that could purchase an entire row of brick houses in the industrial slums. The French chef ruled his culinary domain with terrifying, theatrical violence. He frequently refused to learn English, forcing the exhausted, terrified kitchen maids to desperately interpret his screamed, heavily accented demands. He hurled heavy copper pans across the room if a sauce separated. He hoarded the most expensive imported ingredients, skimming massive, untaxed profits from the household accounts with an audacity that the English housekeeper could never dare to challenge. The masters upstairs were so completely terrified of losing their prestigious, temperamental culinary artist to a social rival that they turned a deliberate blind eye to the absolute reign of terror he inflicted upon the vulnerable women trapped beneath him. The basement was severely fractured by a chaotic, vicious nationalism, a place where a foreign accent could mean the difference between absolute, unchecked power and agonizing, daily starvation. For the true outsider, the profound tragedy of the Victorian townhouse was the complete and utter absence of a sanctuary. The native English maid might endure crushing manual labor 6 days a week, but on her Sunday afternoon off, she could walk into the public parks and temporarily blend into the sprawling crowd. She belonged to the city. The immigrant servant had absolutely nowhere to hide. If an African footman or an Indian nanny stepped out of the tradesman's entrance on their day off, they were immediately subjected to the brutal, aggressive racism of the London streets. They were stared at, mocked, violently shoved, and frequently physically assaulted by the resentful, impoverished working classes who viewed them as alien threats taking their jobs. Therefore, the safest place for the outsider was the very prison that relentlessly exploited them. They locked themselves inside the damp, unlit cellars on their days off, actively choosing the predictable, familiar cruelty of the basement over the chaotic, violent hatred of the mob outside. They lived in a state of permanent exile, their identities slowly and methodically being erased by the grinding machinery of the house. They forgot the vibrant taste of the food from their homelands. They forgot the melodic sound of their mother tongues, replacing them with the soft, deferential whispers demanded by the English aristocracy. They became phantoms, haunting a country that refused to acknowledge their humanity. But profound isolation is a dangerous, highly volatile element. The masters believed that by keeping their servants deeply divided by race, nationality, and vicious internal ranks, they could permanently prevent them from ever finding common ground. They believed the thick stone walls of the basement were entirely soundproof, heavily insulated against the shifting political winds of the outside world. They were catastrophically wrong. When you completely strip a human being of their home, their language, and their community, you leave them with absolutely nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature in any empire. While the masters slept securely in their massive velvet beds, arrogant in their belief that the lower classes were too stupid and too divided to challenge the natural order, a new, terrifying energy was beginning to pulse through the dark corridors. As the freezing winter of 1888 approached its deepest, darkest point, a subtle shift occurred in the damp air of the servants' hall. It was not the sound of a French chef screaming, nor the sound of an Irish maid quietly weeping in the dark. It was the quiet, deliberate rustling of stolen newspaper pages being smoothed out by blistered hands. It was the soft, hesitant sound of young women teaching each other how to read by the dim light of a stolen candle. The era of silent, fractured endurance was slowly coming to an end. The outside world, with its roaring labor strikes and radical new philosophies, was finally breaching the impenetrable basement walls. The heavy brass bell wires that had once only carried the arrogant commands of the masters were about to vibrate with the creeping, unstoppable sickness of rebellion. Listen carefully to the heavy, suffocating silence of the basement at 3 a.m. The massive iron kitchen ranges have finally cooled to a dull, glowing red. The brutal, agonizing physical labor of the day has ended, and the absolute masters of the townhouse are deeply asleep in their velvet-draped beds. This is the only hour when the subterranean world truly belongs to the invisible people. For decades, this precious hour was spent in a state of sheer, exhausted unconsciousness. But as the freezing winter of 1888 tightens its grip on the sprawling metropolis of London, the silence is broken by a new, highly dangerous sound. It is not the violent, metallic shaking of the brass bell wires. It is the soft, deliberate rustle of cheap, crumpled paper being slowly smoothed out across the scarred wooden surface of the kitchen table. This faint, whispering sound is the absolute death knell of the Victorian aristocratic order. To understand the profound, seismic shift occurring in the shadows of the servant world, you must look back exactly 18 years before the blood-soaked autumn of 1888. In the year 1870, the British government passed a piece of legislation known as the Elementary Education Act. It was a massive, sweeping reform designed to provide basic, compulsory schooling for the poorest children in the empire. The wealthy politicians in Parliament engineered this act simply to create a more efficient, capable industrial workforce. They wanted factory hands who could read basic instructional manuals and clerks who could add simple ledgers. They did not realize they were handing the keys of the kingdom directly to the people they held captive in their basements. Fast forward to the dark, freezing kitchens of 1888. A terrifying, generational fault line has violently split the hierarchy of the servants' hall. Sitting at the head of the heavy oak table is the housekeeper. She is a woman in her 60s, born long before the education reforms. She is fiercely loyal to the aristocratic system, ruling the lower staff with an iron fist, yet she is almost certainly completely illiterate. Her entire world is confined to the four walls of the townhouse, her knowledge based entirely on rigid tradition and blind obedience. But kneeling on the cold stone floor, scrubbing the heavy iron grates, is a 14-year-old scullery maid. She is bruised, she is starved, and she is treated worse than a stray dog. Yet, she possesses the single most dangerous, explosive weapon in the entire British Empire. She knows her letters. She can read. For the first time in the history of domestic service, the lowest, most thoroughly exploited members of the workforce have direct intellectual access to the outside world. The wealthy masters and mistresses upstairs were completely oblivious to this profound psychological shift. They continued to treat their young servants as deaf, blind beasts of burden. When the master finished reading his morning editions of the Times or the Pall Mall Gazette, he simply threw them into the waste-paper basket by his leather armchair. He casually discarded newspapers containing reports of massive, sweeping global changes, assuming the illiterate ghosts who emptied his trash would merely use the crumpled pages to light the drawing-room fires. He was catastrophically wrong. The young maids and the boot boys meticulously salvaged these discarded papers. They hid them under their coarse canvas aprons. They smuggled them down the steep, narrow, unlit stairs. And in the dead of night, huddled around the dying, flickering light of a stolen tallow candle stub, they read. They read about a world that was rapidly, violently changing just beyond the heavy iron railings of their wealthy residential squares. They read the thrilling, unbelievable aftermath of the match girls' strike from that very summer, marveling at the fact that unskilled, impoverished women just like them had brought a massive, wealthy corporation to its knees simply by refusing to work. They read the quiet, rumbling reports of the London dockworkers beginning to organize their massive, sprawling numbers into aggressive labor unions. They even read the scandalous, highly controversial pamphlets left behind by the master's aristocratic guests. In 1888, a group of middle-class intellectuals in London had recently formed the Fabian Society. They met in the opulent drawing rooms of the West End to drink sherry and casually debate the merits of socialism, the redistribution of extreme wealth, and the fundamental rights of the working class. The masters laughed at these radical ideas over their expensive Cuban cigars, treating poverty as an amusing intellectual exercise. But the invisible people standing silently against the mahogany walls, holding the silver serving trays, were listening to every single word. And later, in the freezing basement, they read the stolen socialist pamphlets not as a parlor game, but as a gospel of pure, unadulterated salvation. If you spend decades engineering a biological machine to obey your every command without question, what happens the moment you accidentally teach that machine how to read the blueprint of its own cage? The rebellion of the Victorian servant was not a loud, fiery uprising. They did not storm the grand staircases with pitchforks and torches. They were far too isolated, far too terrified of losing their character references, and far too dependent on the daily rations of the house to risk an open, violent mutiny. Instead, the rebellion was a slow, creeping, devastating intellectual awakening. For centuries, The lower classes had been aggressively taught by their local vicars and their wealthy employers that their immense suffering was divine will. They were told that God had specifically placed them at the very bottom of the social ladder, and that their excruciating physical pain and their starvation were noble, Christian tests of their spiritual endurance. They were brainwashed to believe that the wealthy masters were inherently superior beings, blessed by the Almighty with supreme intelligence and moral right. The stolen, crumpled newspapers completely shattered this grand, majestic lie. As the young scullery maids dragged their bleeding, swollen fingers across the lines of newsprint, they realized a profound, earth-shattering truth. Their suffering was not ordained by God. Their suffering was a highly calculated, deliberate, man-made economic system. They were not starving because the universe demanded it. They were starving so the master could afford to lose 100 pounds on a single horse race at Ascot. They were dying of exhaustion so the mistress could wear a new, imported silk gown to the theater every single week. Once a human mind grasps the absolute injustice of its own exploitation, the heavy, suffocating spell of submission is permanently broken. A quiet, desperate network of education began to flourish in the dark, hidden spaces of the grand townhouses. The basement transformed into a clandestine, underground school. The young parlor maid who had spent a few years in a village charity school would sit on the edge of a narrow iron cot in the freezing attic, teaching the illiterate boot boy how to spell his own name. They used stolen stubs of black charcoal, carefully scraping the letters onto the backs of greasy, discarded butcher paper. They taught the older, terrified kitchen maids how to read the labels on the expensive imported spice jars, slowly dismantling the absolute, tyrannical monopoly on information held by the corrupt French chefs and the cruel housekeepers. This spreading literacy completely eroded the psychological terror of the basement hierarchy. The young maids no longer looked at the fearsome, silk-clad housekeeper as an infallible, godlike figure. They looked at her and saw exactly what she truly was. She was just another disposable, uneducated worker, entirely brainwashed into protecting a system that would inevitably throw her into the workhouse the moment her aging legs could no longer carry her up the stairs. The masters upstairs began to sense this terrifying, invisible shift in the atmosphere. They could not explicitly define it, but they felt the absolute, terrified subservience of the mid-Victorian era slowly fraying at the edges. They noticed the subtle, dangerous changes in the demeanor of their staff. A footman might look his master directly in the eye a fraction of a second longer than was strictly respectful. A housemaid might fail to turn her face completely to the wallpaper when the mistress walked past her in the corridor. The profound, unshakable stupidity the servants had always flawlessly acted out was beginning to slip, revealing the sharp, calculating, highly aware human beings trapped beneath the coarse cotton uniforms. The upper classes reacted to this subtle defiance with absolute, paranoid fury. They increased the severity of their punishments. They dismissed servants for the slightest, most microscopic infractions. They locked away even more of their belongings, terrified that the creeping rebellion would escalate from the theft of ideas to the outright theft of their silver and their gold. They desperately tried to shove the terrifying genie of working-class consciousness back into the tightly sealed bottle of domestic servitude. But you cannot unteach a mind that has finally learned how to see. You cannot force a person who has read the definition of freedom to willingly, blindly accept the cold, heavy iron of their chains. As the brutal, bloody autumn of 1888 finally gives way to the freezing, bitter snows of winter, the grand Victorian townhouse stands at the edge of an absolute precipice. The horrific murders in Whitechapel are slowly fading from the front pages of the discarded newspapers, replaced by the rising, undeniable roar of a modern, industrialized world demanding basic human rights. The era of the invisible, silent machine is drawing to a close. The foundation of the aristocratic home is structurally, fatally compromised, not by physical rot in the brickwork, but by a massive, unstoppable awakening in the dark, damp cellars below. The great, roaring engine of domestic service has reached its absolute, staggering peak. The people who built the empire with their cracked, bleeding hands are finally looking up at the towering, gaslit ceilings of their prisons, and they are beginning to calculate the exact cost of bringing the entire magnificent, hypocritical structure crashing down. The year 1888 was not merely a date on the calendar. It was the absolute, staggering zenith of the Victorian domestic machine. Never before and never again would so many human beings be swallowed by the dark basements of the British Empire. The system of extreme aristocratic wealth, balanced entirely on the broken spines of 1.5 million invisible workers, had reached its absolute structural limit. The townhouse was functioning at maximum capacity, a roaring, terrifying engine of human compliance. But the fundamental law of any empire, whether it spans the globe or exists entirely within four walls of heavily guarded brick, is that the peak of absolute power is also the exact moment the devastating fall begins. The cracking of the foundation did not happen overnight. It was not a violent explosion that brought the grand houses down. It was a slow, relentless, generational hemorrhage. The young women who had learned to read by the dying light of stolen tallow candles in the winter of 1888 eventually grew older. They had daughters of their own. And when those daughters reached the age of 14, their mothers looked at their own swollen, ruined knees, their scarred hands, and their empty pockets, and they made a profound, silent vow. They would rather see their children starve in the open air than send them down into the suffocating, tyrannical dark of the West End cellars. The world outside the heavy iron railings was rapidly, violently accelerating. The claustrophobic era of the 19th century was giving way to the sprawling, mechanized dawn of the 20th. The profound terror of the character reference, the single piece of paper that had held the entire domestic workforce in absolute, paralyzed captivity, was finally beginning to lose its lethal power. A new, sprawling landscape of employment was emerging in the smog-choked city, and this new world did not care about the strict, hypocritical moral purity demanded by the aristocratic housekeeper. The massive new steam-powered factories, the bustling department stores of Oxford Street, and the soaring, newly built office blocks required millions of hands. They needed shop girls to stand behind the polished glass counters. They needed operators to plug the twisting cables into the terrifying new telephone switchboards. Most importantly, the invention of the commercial typewriter created an entirely new, highly respectable class of female clerical workers. When a young girl from the agricultural shires arrived in London at the turn of the century, she no longer had to walk to the tradesman's entrance of a Mayfair mansion and surrender her entire identity. She could walk into a factory or a typing pool. The work was still agonizingly hard. The wages were still a miserable pittance. The factory bosses were ruthless and cruel. But at the end of the 14-hour shift, the factory whistle blew. And when that whistle blew, the girl could turn her back on her employer and walk away. She could rent a tiny, freezing room in a cheap boarding house, but it was her room. The door had a lock on the inside. She did not have to sleep under the same roof as the men who controlled her wages. She did not have to turn her face to the wallpaper when a wealthy gentleman walked past her on the street. She had her Sunday entirely to herself, without the terrifying, ticking clock of a basement curfew hanging over her head. She had clawed back the single most precious commodity the human soul requires to survive. She had reclaimed her autonomy. The upper classes watched this mass exodus with absolute, paralyzed horror. By the early years of the new century, the wealthy elite began writing frantic, deeply panicked letters to the editors of the major London newspapers, constantly complaining about a terrifying new social crisis they bitterly called the servant problem. They simply could not comprehend why the young women of the lower classes no longer wanted to live in their damp, freezing attics. They offered slightly better wages. They reluctantly offered a full day off every other week. They even tried to soften the brutal, militarized discipline of the housekeeper. But it was far too little, and it was decades too late. The deep, generational resentment had calcified into absolute stone. The invisible people had finally looked up from the floorboards, and they were walking out the back door in their tens of thousands, never to return. This mass departure revealed a terrifying architectural truth about the Victorian townhouse. The grand, towering structures were completely, utterly helpless without their human engines. The wealthy masters had built their lavish homes as monuments to their own supreme power, designing massive coal cellars, sprawling kitchens, and 6 flights of sweeping stairs. But they had never bothered to consider how to maintain this colossal square footage without an army of starving people forced to carry the water and scrub the stone. As the footmen left for the factories and the scullery maids left for the department stores, the towering castles of the West End slowly began to rot from the inside out. The heavy copper bell wires that snaked through the plaster walls, the very central nervous system of the house, began to snap from disuse. The brass bells hanging on the wooden board in the dark hallway slowly gathered a thick layer of green tarnish. The roaring, massive iron kitchen ranges grew cold, replaced by smaller, efficient gas stoves that did not require a human being to sacrifice their lungs to the cold dust. When the invisible foundation of your entire reality decides to simply walk away, how long does it take for the towering illusion of your supremacy to collapse into dust? The final, absolute death blow to the subterranean world did not come from a labor strike or a technological invention. It came from the staggering, apocalyptic violence of the First World War in 1914. The massive, mechanized slaughter of the trenches completely shattered the old global order. The rigid, terrifying class system of the Victorian era simply could not survive the sheer volume of blood spilled on the fields of Europe. The sons of the wealthy masters and the sons of the starving boot boys died side by side in the mud, entirely erasing the artificial, heavily guarded borders that had separated them in the London townhouses. When the war finally ended, the world that had existed in the autumn of 1888 was completely, irreversibly gone. The great aristocratic families, their wealth heavily depleted by terrifying new taxes and the staggering loss of a generation of young men, could no longer afford to staff their massive, sprawling estates. The 5-story mansions were quietly sold off, carved up by developers into small, modern flats, or converted into anonymous, sterile corporate offices. The heavy oak tables in the servants' halls were chopped up for firewood. The dark, treacherous stairs were sealed behind cheap drywall. The invisible city was permanently buried. Stand on the pavement of a wealthy London residential square today. Look up at the towering, white stucco facades of the grand houses. The heavy yellow smog of the coal fires has finally cleared from the sky. The horse-drawn carriages have been replaced by the low, steady hum of modern traffic. The people walking past you are looking down at glowing screens, entirely disconnected from the deep, buried history resting directly beneath the soles of their shoes. But if you step closer to the iron railings, you can still see the physical scars of the past. Look down into the deep, concrete trench separating the street from the house. The tradesman's entrance is still there. The heavy wooden door is locked, painted a high glossy black, hiding the damp cellars from the modern world. The small, barred windows of the basement look blindly out into the concrete wall. The silence down there is absolute. There is no metallic shaking of the brass bells. There is no sound of heavily breathing women carrying mountains of coal up the unlit stairs. There is no smell of caustic soda, boiling cabbage, or cheap tallow candles. The suffocating terror of the housekeeper is gone. The predatory footsteps of the master's son, echoing in the attic, are completely faded. The house has finally been sanitized. The blood, the tears, and the agonizing physical destruction of 1,000,000 forgotten lives have been flawlessly scrubbed away by the passage of time, leaving only a beautiful, empty architectural shell. History has written its books about the queens, the politicians, and the serial killers who haunted the fog. It has neatly filed the autumn of 1888 away as a dark, thrilling chapter of true crime and aristocratic elegance. But true history does not live in the grand drawing rooms, and it is not recorded in the official ledgers of the empire. True history lives in the shadows, built by the cracked hands of the people who were never allowed to speak their own names. The women who bled on the stone steps, the men who suffocated in the damp cellars, and the children who were worked to death in the freezing kitchens have all slipped away into the absolute, merciful quiet of the dark. Their character references have crumbled into dust. Their exhausted bodies are buried in the unmarked, overcrowded graves of the forgotten poor. They are the invisible ghosts of a fallen empire. The copper wires are broken and the brass bells are finally silent. But if you press your hand against the cold stone walls of the basement, you can still feel the heavy, beating heart of the people who carried the entire world on their shoulders, waiting in the dark for a morning that never came.